Thank you, Wendy. We are greatly honored to have Dr. Ismael Serageldin with us today, who has dedicated a lifetime to working for reducing poverty, and will share with us his vision and reflections on how we can feed the world in a sustainable way today and tomorrow. So not only today, but also tomorrow. So Ismael is the director of the Library of Alexandria, Egypt. It's a beautiful library. I had a chance to visit it almost 20 years ago. It is still as beautiful as it is today. And we are actually going to have a conference in your facility in November. And he is former chairman of the CGIAR Consultative Group on International Agriculture Research, as Malthus said. His leadership, his dedication, his commitment were really missed by many, particularly during the current CGIAR reform. The strong leadership and your commitment were just great. And he is also the founder and a former chairman of the Global Water Partnership and a microfinance program, a consultative group to assist the poorest. So Ismael has also served several capacities at the World Bank, including the Vice President for Environmentally and Socially Sustainable Development. As somebody told me that you were the youngest Vice President that time. So we were very proud to have him as a member of the IFPRI 2020 Advisory Council 2020 initiative, which seeks to promote a shared vision for meeting food needs while reducing poverty and protecting natural resources. And food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. So although progress has been made, we are far from having achieved global food security. And new challenges such as rapid population growth, changing eating habits, climate change, water scarcity, and volatile food prices are threatening the well-being of the world's poorest. So in order to achieve the first Millennium Development Goal of having hunger by 2015, which is only 4 years away, scientists, policymakers, so entrepreneurs, and civil society need to work together to address the complex web of factors that continue to sustain hunger in the world. So I'm looking very much forward to hearing the vision and the reflections from an elder statesman who has been involved in these issues since decades. So it is an honor and a pleasure to me to hand the floor over to Dr. Ismael Serageldin. Thank you.
Thank you, friends. I wonder if we could ask our colleagues to cut these lights, because then you'll have a much livelier image on the wall. And because I have a lot to say and only 40 minutes to say it in, I will use images, because as they say, a picture sometimes is worth 1,000 words. So these strong lights, I think, yes, that's much better. Okay. Let me start. This is the outline that I intend to follow. And I'll say a few words about challenging Malthus and hunger and poverty and food security and gender, environment and science and policy and agriculture. A lot to say, but let's try. So anyway, every time you see one of those red slides, you'll know that I'm starting a new chapter and I'm getting closer to the end. So not to worry. So let me start by challenging Malthus. Well, Malthus obviously was wrong. There is no way he could have imagined in his day a world with 7 billion people on it. But Malthus, even if he was wrong, he has a strange position, like a specter that keeps coming back, because sure, he was wrong about the immediacy, But is he going to be wrong tomorrow? The day after tomorrow? So this kind of his posture, you see, the way he postulated the problem makes it an everlasting problem as population grows, as we confront other challenges. And it is true that hunger and famine persist, but they persist really for other reasons, not so much for production. Today, in fact, we have surplus productions in many parts of the world, and many people who are grossly overweight, and we do have famines elsewhere. And in fact, those of you who've been following the news should know that there's one right now in the making on the Horn of Africa, again, after the worst drought in many, many years. Now, I say that at the beginning of the 19th century, late 18th, beginning of the 19th century, there were people who looked at the condition of slavery and thought that it was beneath any definition of humanity. And they challenged it. And they didn't talk about minor improvements or reducing numbers. They talked about abolishing it. And they were known as the abolitionists. And they came with a sense of moral outrage. And I said that this sense of moral outrage, demands that we abolish this. William Wilberforce was one of those. He agitated. He got the abolishment of the slave trade in 1807. But every year he would put forward the bill for the total abolition of slavery, and it passed the year of his death in 1833. Other abolitionists in the United States, of course, had to go through a civil war before it was finally done. But the truth is, these people fought against amazing odds. They were few, there were enormous economic interests, there was a major disinterest on the powers that be, and yet in the end, they prevailed. And it is much like that this situation that has been cartooned here, I think, raises a question for us, in fact, whether we can tolerate to have these continued famines in the world today, when there is surplus crops in many parts of the world and availability elsewhere. I say we must abolish hunger, the same way people abolished slavery. Not half measures, not saying we are going to reduce them from 850 million to 425. Oh, well, we didn't make it 425, we have 480 million people who are still hungry. There should be no individual on earth who is denied that most fundamental of all human rights, which is the right to eat. So we must become the new abolitionists with the same moral outrage, and we could do a lot. We could abolish hunger, and things can change, however, as I said, because the challenges keep mounting. We talked about population, and it's true, and that's why I said that Malthus has a way of having been proven wrong for the time being, and he is always there, coming back again. It was Marx and Engels who said there's a specter haunting Europe, it's a specter of communism. Now I think there's a specter haunting the world, and it's the specter of Malthus. He is always with us. What about not only increasing population, but changing diets as people become richer and want animal proteins? What happens then? So what is the condition of hunger? In the West, we take abundant food for granted, but that is not the case elsewhere in the world. The tragic situation is after having 200 heads of state and government sign off on the Millennium Development Goal in 2000, we have almost 1 billion people going hungry. Instead of going down towards 425, it went up from 850. Distribution of a hunger map around the world is quite obviously the distribution of poverty. Right? Pretty much, you can almost see it matches one and the other. Sub-Saharan Africa remains the most vulnerable region with the most rapid growth, the worst infrastructure, the greatest vulnerability on agricultural production and water resources. And today, after prolonged drought, this issue of The Economist, this week's issue of The Economist, I got this map from it, where in fact precipitation levels were below normal levels, for over 50% below normal levels in many of these places, and where we are now beginning to see again, massive numbers of poor and hungry people being wiped out and going to refugee camps. So humanitarian food aid will continue to be needed in hotspots in the world whenever we're going to be doing, but that is not the solution that we need. This is not the issue we want. It is just to avoid the extreme cases where they occur and where they cannot be ignored. But if you look, the striking thing is, even if we are back here and we stay around this level, we're almost where we were in 1969-70. I mean, it is stunning. Yes, in percentage terms, it has come down very considerably because population growth, but in terms of absolute numbers, it is very sad. Now, different ways of measuring hunger, undernourishment, underweight children, mortality rate of children, etc. Serious, not so serious levels of hunger and disparity. But at the end, it's the poor. There are rich people in poor countries and poor people in rich countries, and it's the poor in both places who suffer from hunger. These are GNP per capita and global hunger index for different parts of the world, and they go invariably in that direction. And again, you can see how sub-Saharan Africa is really the place to look at. One issue which is not sufficiently addressed is that peace is an essential component to dealing with hunger. In fact, civil strife usually results in people being displaced from their farms, with the disruption of distribution systems and accessibility to food. And as a result, therefore, where you have a lot of ethnic strife, where you have a lot of problems, you end up also having displaced populations and hunger. And again, it is said that the weakest, poorest continent is the one where there are the most wars, and yet they are not perhaps sufficiently covered. For the war in Congo actually claimed what was the largest war in the world, 5 million victims since the Second World War. So it's sad. Queues of refugees trying to find something to eat. We need moral outrage at that. Looking at conditions of that kind challenges our common humanity. In fact, there's a moving story. This picture of a vulture waiting for that girl to run out of ability and to be able to eat her, pick at her, was taken by photographer Kevin Carter, and it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1994. And a lot of people wanted to know what happened to the girl. Well, I'll tell you, actually the little girl was able to crawl until she was given food. But what is interesting is Kevin Carter committed suicide 3 months later. He was just totally depressed by what he saw, what he documented. He was a witness for us all. And so when I say that we have to become the new abolitionists on the issue of hunger, it is not just a technical issue of price volatility, it is not just an issue of agricultural productivity, although it is all of that, but it is more than that. It is something that touches something profound in our common humanity. Now, the main thing we need to address directly is that the primary cause of hunger is extreme poverty. And extremely poor people are just unable to have access to the amount of food they need. And Amartya Sen, as you know, did work with Jean Drèze a long time ago on famines and showed that you could have production and famines simultaneously in the same country or in close by countries, for which he won the Nobel Prize. Now, Norman Borlaug, who's been mentioned here, was a guru to us all. Both Amartya and Norm are people I'm proud to call my friends and my gurus. Both of them, I mean, Borlaug understood that one way of bringing prices down that will make things accessible to a lot of people is to have a lot of production. And therefore, the two are not opposed, as some NGOs would like us to say. Why are you worrying about production? You should just be worrying about distribution. No, we should worry about both. The reality is that food is either you buy it or you grow it. And what is surprising, and you'll see here a graph in a moment, is that even people who grow it tend to buy a lot of it. And here's the graph. The proportion of the poor population who are net buyers or sellers of rice, wheat, maize, and beans. And as you can see, the green are the net producers, the sellers, and the blue are barely self-sufficient, but the yellow and the orange and the red are all purchasers. Some are urban, but some are rural. So even in the rural world, there are a lot of poor people who buy their food. That means that one way of really helping them is to reduce the price of food. Now, if you increase production sustainably, we have to add the word sustainably, then you have to reduce waste and ensure access. But then what about the poor smallholder farmers who are the major producers of food in the world and who are the majority of the poor? Despite the fact that we're moving towards urban, so far, still the absolute number of very poor households are still rural. What about them? If we reduce the price, they will become even poorer. The answer to that is to raise productivity for the smallholder farmers faster than the prices drop. Now, that's the catch here, is to raise productivity for the smallholder farmer, not in the experimental station, not at Monsanto, not at the big Midwestern farms and concerns, at the smallholder farmer level where they exist. And that is the answer. That's what happened during a period of, for example, of the Green Revolution, where we see here, that's the price of rice going on one side and the productivity increase on the other side. And you can see that the productivity increase is bigger than the price drop, and therefore their income improves just as the overall price comes down and the available amount becomes available for everybody. And as you've heard the definition before of food security, it is for each individual. We have to keep that in mind. That the idea at the end of the day is not to say simply we have enough caloric coverage in the country, yes, but it's not distributed well. And as a result, you have people who are going hungry and who are chronically malnourished in certain pockets in various countries. In fact, if that was the case, there would be no hungry people in the United States, ever. My friend David Beckman, who won the World Food Prize last year, from Bread for the World, of course, has been documenting that every year. Why is that? Well, because there's an enormous gap that exists between the rich and the poor in every country. There are rich people and there are poor people in the rich countries, as well as in the poor countries. And this is a stunning picture from Brazil, in Sao Paulo. It really is two worlds. The world of the poor, as a wall here, and the world of the rich, even this luxury condominium with a separate swimming pool in every balcony, and rubbing shoulders. I mean, literally, that is part of the urban reality in many countries. So everywhere we talk about, it's not just the rich countries and the poor countries. I am as concerned about hungry people who are homeless in the rich countries as I am about those who find no food in the poor countries. And then we need to define also, contrary to what many economists say, that poverty is not just the absence of money. When I was a graduate student at Harvard, I was broke, but I wasn't poor. I wasn't marginalized, I could participate in society, I had views, I had prospects, I had very different stories. So but the marginalization, deprivation, social exclusion that comes with it, the loss of dignity that is associated with poverty, the social exclusion, and these are, purposely I picked pictures from the north for these few pictures here. And sadly, we see more of the poor in the cities, even though we try to sweep them away and hide them in particular places so that they don't sort of disturb our overall image. But as I said, still rural poverty is still a major part of the world, extreme rural poverty. And Amartya Sen did some work on showing that access was important, and Partha Dasgupta did pioneering work many years ago that I helped launch at the World Bank at the time, and that work is about the ultra poor. What he said, in fact, in that book was that the ultra poor do not respond to market signals, and that the idea of just trickle down solving the problem is not necessarily correct. The mathematics into it, we can get into that, but not today. And much economic analysis tends to erase these human factors because we tend to talk about averages. and average GDP growth across all sectors, average income consumption, average this, average that, and yet we know that the issues of hunger are associated with the extremes, not with the averages. So distributions count. Anyway, a beautiful commentary on economic analysis and policies comes from this guy. I think that's a statement that is appropriate summation of views about certain policies that are being pursued. And if I may say, it represents also my view of many of the policies that are being advocated by a group calling itself the Tea Party in the United States. But anyway. So because of this issue of averages and the issue of extremes and the issue that economics and income are just one dimension, we really need thoughtful use of multiple indicators for analysis that will lead to richer and more nuanced policy. And this is, for example, my friends in IFPRI have been working on multidimensional poverty assessment tools called EMPATH and so on. But the end of it is not whether the tool is accurate to measure. Partly it's whether the data is available, and partly is whether the measurement can be interpreted into effective policy and program actions. If it's not, then it may be of interest, but of no real value in attacking the problem. Urban poverty is rising. Take an example of averages. China definitely has made an enormous improvement by any measure one wants. There's an impact, of course, on the environmental side, but even in terms of lifting more people out of poverty than any society in history, certainly growing at a very fast rate, certainly doing a lot of things that are visually even stunning in terms of modernization. But the fact is that gaps are showing up in society, gaps are increasing between the rich and poor in China as well as in India. And that the rag pickers and the bottom of the barrel in many societies with urbanization, which is going very, very fast, urbanization is going very fast, faster than the ability of many societies to provide basic services, results in conditions of living that are not only unhealthy, but that are also associated with extreme poverty. But so far, only in Latin America is the percentage of the poorest of the poor higher in urban areas than it is in rural areas. But almost everywhere else, the percentages, the rural poor is where the biggest problem is. Now, to reach the poorest, you have to find issues or ways of reaching them. This is from China, actually. To me, the single most important step you can take is to reduce the price of food, because that translates immediately into their pockets. They buy their food, and their food is a major part of their budget, so without administration, without anything else, you have made a major transfer to them if they can buy the same food for 2/3 of the price that they were spending before, or they can buy more. You need to increase the opportunities for employment of the poor, but very frequently recognize that they lack the skills for the kind of high-tech jobs that are being created. And that you need, therefore, to take a new look at the informal economy in many societies. And you increase the return to the kind of skills and assets that the poor have, and that means labor primarily, rather than capital. So these are kind of answers for that. I do not believe that urban agriculture is going to be a major solution in the aggregate. It will be a component of a solution, but it's not the solution. In fact, the basic thrust of what I'm saying today is that there is no the solution. There are a lot of partial things that have to be taken together. Rural poverty, we have roads that get wiped out with any rain or monsoon. We need to have investments in infrastructure. Education in rural areas, no desks, no schools, no nothing. We need to remove the urban bias against the rural areas in roads, education, health, etc. We need to improve access to markets and reduce post-harvest losses. Now, all of that has to be done at the level of the smallholder farmer. Why are the smallholder farmers facing such challenges? Well, for one thing, globalization, including the appearance of supermarkets in developing countries, in poor countries, who refuse to buy from them. because the quality of the appearance of their product is not as good. There are low world market prices for agriculture. There's the impact of climate change that brings vulnerability. There's HIV/AIDS, which strikes them disproportionately, especially in Africa. And there's a continuing population growth that is making small farms smaller, usually by subdivision among children of a diseased farmer, or the deceased in terms of dying farmer who passed on to the next generation. They subdivide the small farm even smaller. And ultimately, they have no political voice. That's part of the problem. Now, food security, as we said, is for everybody. And therefore, it's not just production, but also access. It's not just the output, but also the process by which it was done. It has to be done sustainably. And it's not the availability of a technology. There has to be a policy framework, a context that makes that technology adaptable and adoptable. And it's not just about global balances, but it's also national, because we have, we just looked at the Horn of Africa map. We have had famines in North Korea at a time when food was bountiful. So we have in the aggregate. And it's not only that, it's not even national. It really occurs at the level of households. And as I said, if it was national, who could say there's anybody going hungry in the United States? One of the largest, most effective producers of food and agricultural commodities in the world. And it's not just rural, it's also urban. And then it's also not just the amount of food that we're consuming, but the content, the quality of the nutrition that comes with it. So as you can see, the problem is multifaceted, and therefore looking for silver bullets would be a mistake. And much of the debate that I hear between scientists and NGOs and policymakers is really biased. If you take short-term, medium-term, and long-term, and look at local, national, and global, and you have a short-term local problem, all you can do really is access and quality of nutrition. That's the only thing you can work on. But if you're looking at the long term and globally, then you are concerned about sustainable production and fair trade systems. So we need to work on all of these at the same time. It's not either or, it is both and. And that's really important to follow up. Why? Because global food production must grow by, and these numbers change depending on who you see it. I will always trust IFPRI numbers, and if they tell me we have new ones other than that, I will use it. This one was given by the IFPRI president, but the orders of magnitude are there. 40% increase over what we now have by 2030, 70% increase by 2050. A stunning challenge. And Malthus is in the wings to say, I told you so. He's around. That's the power of the Malthusian. No matter how many times you defeat it, the question is, well, you'll be able to defeat it next time, next challenge. So there we are. And we recognize that production is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. But we need to focus on the smallholder. And in doing this, for the sustainability dimension, another very wise guru of mine, my good friend M.S. Swaminathan, whom, of course, everybody here knows, he reminds me and reminds us all, he says, we are all on this earth as guests of the green plants and those who tend them. And that's a very profound statement. Think about it for a moment, and you realize the importance of those smallholder farmers, the importance of the green plants, whether they are the forest or in the farm. Population growth is there, diets are changing, and we need to produce the food without destroying the patrimony. We have to produce differently, not less. Shipping food is going to become an important part, but no substitute for overall, and we have to reach the smallholder farmer. So 7 issues or statements about food security. First is, to me, no matter how long and how profoundly I reflect on this issue, there is no substitute to the idea of increasing productivity and production. How to reduce prices without harming the poor farmers? That's the diagram you saw earlier on. We have to achieve that again and again and again. And it's not easy, but it's feasible. How? Well, for one thing, better management. And that is stunning to me, better management. There's the SRI, which is the System for Rice Intensification, that my friend Norman Uphoff keeps advancing. Good the results from Madagascar, good results from Indonesia, and shows that even with the same inputs, same plants, same inputs, but improving management, you can get 15 to 20% more. So that's good. But even more dramatically would be to reduce losses and reduce waste. Now, in the poor countries, as much as 30% of some of the crops are lost because of very primitive ways of handling the harvest, and especially among the poor farmers. The storage is very bad, diseases come in, attacks are made, things get rotted. So even production that is made and harvested doesn't reach the ultimate consumer. And in the rich countries, depending on the studies, up to 30% of the cooked food is thrown out. Now just imagine that on the scale of the United States or on the scale of continental Europe. What are we talking about? And that's not all. There was a study in Europe that showed that up to 20% of the purchased food is thrown out unused in its plastic wrapper. People buy it, they put it in their fridge, and then they look at the expiration date, out it goes. That's again a massive amount of food. So you have the post-harvest losses in the poor countries, but there's an enormous waste in the rich countries. I was with my friend Naim Sherbini more than once to a restaurant in Arlington where we both live, and they insist on serving you portions that no human being could possibly finish. And they are forbidden by law from reserving that food to anybody else. So effectively, unless you're going to take a plastic bag and take it with you home because you happen to have one, but if you're passing through like I do, it becomes very difficult, and there's a lot of waste going on. The quality of the food, the amount of effort and cost that goes into its preparation is what really gives us this cartoon, again, with enormous power, and where I think we really must say, this is not acceptable anymore. It really is not acceptable. If we are unable to implement the first Millennium Development Goal, surely we cannot accept the practices that exist today, and we need to deal with that. We also need to manage vulnerability, because poverty is one thing. I mean, I've been talking about it so far as if it was a constant condition, but it's not. What I talked about in the case of the Horn of Africa is the result of the vulnerability of these people to the rainfall. And vulnerability is different from the absolute condition, which you may measure statically at one point or another. So vulnerability in rich countries, yes, the homeless, the nameless, who are there. This was a good cartoon. I couldn't remember. Great news, you guys. The USDA says we're no longer hungry, we're just food insecure. Well, you know, some people are food challenged, I guess, is the but the words don't change the reality. In the developing countries, most farmers live precariously. The downside for them is devastating. So when people say, why do farmers not want to experiment and take on new things? I say, well, wait a minute. They're being very wise, because the cost of loss for them is enormous. So they would rather have something that's more secure, that's less risky, rather than maximize their return. But if they see evidence that shows them that the return is high, they adopt it, and we saw that with the Green Revolution. And you have this. In our international organization jargon, we have ways of sanitizing things. So this is called, I remember from my days at the World Bank, this is a picture from my days at the World Bank, is called a low potential environment. I mean, basically, it's misery. But the main thing is, just if you were, these lady farmers here, that's all they have. How can you say to them, you know, why aren't you doing more? Well, conditions are extremely difficult. They have a small village here. The next village is 20 kilometers away. So there's no way of trading, like, for example, high density situations in Bangladesh, in India, and so on, allow microfinance operations to go on off-farm employment. Rural off-farm employment can supplement income because there's enough movement. But if you're isolated in the Sahel, where this picture was taken, low potential environments are very, very difficult to deal with. Even the best scientists would have problems with it. And if you look at the rainfall, yes, it's very variable year by year, but on the long term, it seems to be coming down. And that is, of course, scary. So we have systems of outreach. The extension work must bring the research to these farmers, focusing on their problem. Otherwise, the problems of average farms are not going to help these low potential environments. Biofortification, which really IFPRI pioneered in the CGIAR and is elsewhere, is improving the nutritional content of the food. We all know the case of golden rice, which is vitamin A enriched rice that Ingo Potricus and Ron Bayer succeeded in doing after 10 years of work by taking genes from Erwinia bacterium and 2 types of daffodils, creating a biochemical pathway that was then inserted into the rice plant to allow pro-beta carotene, which normally the rice plant would put in the leaves, to go into the grain. And that really, or into at least the shell of the grain. And that really allows children who have vitamin A deficiency, who are so poor that they can have only white rice, maybe 300 grams of it a day, boiled rice, they can get at least the required dose. That's what's waited for it. We need to do more on biofortification, but that is well underway. There's a wonderful program at IFPRI, which was supported by the Gates Foundation, if I remember correctly, Schengen. And we also need to redress the issue of biofuels. I feel very strongly about that. The first generation of biofuels, which is ethanol from corn, especially in the United States, is personally, to my view, criminal. And it did contribute, I'm not going to say how much, but it did contribute to the price spike and the tortilla riots and other impacts in 2008. But fundamentally, I believe it is wrong to burn the food of the poor to drive the cars of the rich. That's the bottom line. I mean, I think there's a moral issue here. And especially that the conversion rates are very poor in environmental terms, and what is more is that we don't have really much reason to do so. Cellulosic grasses, algae, other things would be much more efficient. So we must move to second generation biofuels. And finally, international trade. Well, international trade, I could give you all sorts of statistics, subsidies going on, aside from the subsidies to biofuels. They are being collected by rich companies like Archer Daniel Midlands, and they're not going to the mom and pop farms that the United States talks about. In fact, over this 10-year period, the top 1% got 23% of the subsidies, and the lower 80% got 13%. The lower 80% of the farmers in the United States got only 13% of the government subsidies. So if there's a case to abolish subsidies, it's there. Europe is not much better. In fact, this summarizes it quite well. An average cow gets $2.20 a day for being a cow in Europe. And the kid in Africa, at best, is less than $1 a day. My friend Zapiro of South Africa sort of summarized the debate by saying, let the competition begin between the first world and the third world, subsidized and unsubsidized. So these are 7 issues, but I can't stop without raising with you the gender dimension and nutrition in particular. Not only we must never forget the gender dimension, because women are the primary forces for not only societal change, but for the creation of social capital. And I have lots of evidence that we can talk about that as well. And the women in Africa, as you know, produce 80% of the food, receive 10% of the wages, and own only 1% of the land. Stunning statistics all. And it's essential to recognize their role in food production. Most of the men work in cash crops, not in food crops. And empowering women results in major improvements in infant mortality as well, school enrollments, child morbidity. All of that improves dramatically by empowering the women. And they have unequal opportunity in all of these areas. But also, only 15% of the extension workers are women. And yet, when you work with the women farmers directly, you get very good results in many places. The other big issue is that nutrition programs that are sent into poor countries and supported by donors tend to focus in schools or school-age populations. And I think that's wrong. I think they need to go to mothers. Maternal health is the single most important vector to improve the condition of child health. From the 6 months of pregnancy and to the 18th month of life, this is where a lot of the future of the child will be formed. And in fact, the period when children are most vulnerable to hunger of the mother initially and then hunger of the child. And malnourished mothers produce low birth weight babies, and the children suffer growth retardation and weight loss associated with lots of morbidity and even infant mortality. Breast milk has the best nutritional value, as we know, and yet it's very difficult for a weak, sick, malnourished mother to try to suckle her children. So a healthy mother will give birth to a baby of normal weight, will breastfeed her baby well, and will be able to find good food to wean her baby. And that is the period, incidentally, from 6 to 18 months, when 90% of the brain is formed in a child. So if you look at all of these statistics together, you say, wait a minute, why are we focusing the nutritional programs on schools? We should focus it on maternal health and empowering the women. You'd get much better results later on. Environment, well, I think we're all concerned with climate change. These pictures you all know, but these two pictures come from not a scientific journal, from National Geographic. These are the number of hurricane tracks over a 10-year period, and that is the number of hurricane tracks over the next 10-year period. First 10-year period, second 10-year period. Doesn't take a genius to notice that it's increasing. And can this be just a natural phenomenon? The answer is no. And how do we know that? We know that the greenhouse gas emissions are there, but this diagram convinced me. This is a modeling that has been done. The black is the observed. The blue is taking only natural items in consideration. The red is both anthropogenic and natural. And as you can see, there is a deviation that occurs from the late 50s, somewhere around here, and only by introducing the anthropogenic part are you able to model something that approximates the observed reality. And that, after all, is what science is all about. And as some of you may have heard, there may be a reprieve on climate change if indeed the solar flares issue turns out to be correct, but it's just a reprieve for a few decades. The question is whether we would use the reprieve wisely or not. Should we be concerned? I think the answer is yes. And I think the melting ice is the first and immediate concern, not just for the polar bears, although I think they should be protected. But the problem itself is very serious. The IPCC actually looked at all the existing models, and this is the range they chose in 2007, the gray one, and the red one is their chosen path. The black is the actual observation by satellite. So anybody who said that the IPCC was alarmist and not true. In fact, the worst scenarios that the scientists were working on were too optimistic. And actually, the whole history of IPCC is like every 5 years they come out, reconfirm what they said before, and said, and actually it's going worse than we said. Not only did everything we say get confirmed, but it's worse. So every 5 years we do this, and we're going to do it again, I think. For me, my country, the Nile. For us, we are the gift of the Nile. This is all desert, and as you can see, the greenery, and there's the delta. We have a very flat delta, and what happens with seawater rise will have a major impact and could wipe out a significant part of the delta. But more importantly, increased floods, droughts, forest fires, and desertification, shortening of the farming season. This is for Africa, sub-Saharan African Sea, the shortening of the farming season being very, very serious. Yes, it does improve, but only in those green little spots here. For the rest of it, it's all negative. So somebody says, it will improve in places and get negative in others. Yeah, well, okay, here. It improves here and here. But that's not much compared to the rest. So we need mitigation and adaptation right away. We need to reduce emissions and also recognize that it does affect hunger. Even with floods, floods in Pakistan cost about 20% of the crops that year in Pakistan. And droughts in Russia resulted in Russia slapping on an export ban on its grain. So droughts and floods at the same time. And yes, the models actually say We will have both, and we do have both, and that's observing us. And the hurricanes hitting the Caribbean and the United States are increasing, as we saw. And all of these intemperate weather conditions have an impact on the food on which we all depend. And drought devastates agriculture, especially in Africa. And I just gave you the statistics for East Africa, where these pictures are taken from. So science needs to be mobilized, and science needs to address that, not just by the Green Revolution, which I think has had a bad rap among environmentalists, because the Green Revolution, simply stated, by increasing productivity, avoided bringing under production areas, the little green triangles, that if you add them all up, is 300 million hectares. That's about the total productive area, arable land of Brazil, Canada, and the United States combined. So you can imagine how many more forests would have been destroyed, how many more species would have been lost. And what's more, the germplasm from that is spreading to this day. We have excellent collections to work with, which have now been put under intergovernmental oversight. And more generally, the genetically diverse crops is what we need. So what we need is more diversity, less reliance on chemicals, more work with IPM, better soil, water, and nutrient integrated management of small farms, recognize the gender dimension, and avoid destructive practices and respect the environment, and still go always pro-poor, pro-women, and pro-environment. That will require contextualization research and the mobilization of the new life sciences. But we need to address every one of those 5 areas. Land is not only being reclaimed, it's being eroded and degraded, and topsoil is being lost. And this is extremely serious. So no-till practices, other ways like that have to do a major improvement. We are already losing land that's under arable construction. Water, I was the one who in 1995 said the wars of this century have been on oil and the wars of the next century shall be on water. And somebody in the first decade of this year wrote in Nature, and I responded, they said, we haven't had a war yet. I said, it's only been the first decade of the century. We have a long way to go. Let's wait and see. We know we're using a lot of water. 1 calorie equals 1 liter on average. So you may drink 2 liters of water a day, but you actually consume, if you eat 2,700 calories, 2,700 liters worth of food. So the link with agriculture is extremely powerful. We're pumping water from underground. The result is dropping water tables everywhere. And as a result, the recharge rates of aquifers is very poor. This is a well in the Sahel that where the water table has gone down, and people have dug deeper, 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 deeper. And at the bottom, they just have a few drops of muddy water that you see there. Then with desertification, what do you get? You get environmental refugees, marginalization. And again, that's what the economist was talking about with the map that I showed you on the Horn of Africa. Severe drought resulted in people like that not being able to live in the so-called low potential environments, and therefore they had to move. And incidentally, the UN has very nice, again, sanitized words for that. They are IDPs, which stands for internally displaced people. See, if they are still within the boundaries of the political state, they are IDPs. If they have to cross the political boundary to be refugees. But for our purposes, they are environmental refugees, and we need more crop per drop. We need to address how we're going to get better crops. Well, we have a yield ceiling that we know of today, and we have a current average in every country. So you can push the yield ceiling further, or you can try to close the yield gap between what the average farmer gets and what the scientists prove on the extension. But you also have to do a lot just to keep from losing current levels of production. So a lot of research goes into just maintaining current levels. So I'm not going to focus on current levels. We'll take them by turn. Actually, to raise the yield ceiling, you need to change the architecture of the plant, and that's being done in the CGIAR centers, and like the rice plant, for example. To close the yield gap, you need to identify where the areas, the problems are, work with biological controls, IPM, working with nature as much as possible, but also make use of other things. This is finding resistance to bacterial blight. This is taking biotechnology, and you can see how larvae are affected by transgenic rice. The control between the stem borer, larvae dies at the top and survives at the bottom. We need to raise agricultural productivity, but measured in total factor productivity: land, water, labor, energy, and chemical inputs, not just in terms of output per unit of land. And that needs a lot of technologies. Animals, likewise, are important for smallholder farmers. They suffer from diseases in most of those places, East Coast fever and the like. But animals, because of the demand for animal proteins, are causing an enormous pressure on agricultural demand for feed. And a lot of it is going to come from grains that could be going to humans but are not, and where conversion rates are important. Now, the conversion to proteins, the beef is about 5%, and the pork is 13%, and poultry is 25%. That's different from saying how many you get per, I'm just talking protein. And yet fish are over 30%. So fish are quite good. And yet we are way, way, way behind in aquaculture compared to land agriculture. And we are still, in fact, when it comes to the sea, we are still hunters-gatherers. And only recently are we reaching now, for the first time, 50% of food consumption of seafood is farmed. Before that, it was like closer to 10–15%. We launched the Fish for All in the CGIAR, and IFPRI was a part of that as well. Artisanal techniques have been replaced by heavy factory boats, but we haven't had much farming recently. But aquaculture has grown in 1950, 1 million tons to 47 million tons. And these big trawlers will be left behind. Now, I won't say about coral reefs. I'm a great admirer of that as well. Biotechnology, I'll just say one thing about it, and that is it's a tool like any other tool, should not be demonized or turned into a silver bullet. The power of policy, this is the P in IFPRI, and I'm a great believer in that, and I'll show you one example. Sustainable development does not mean that people will live worse, and look at income and wealth. If you track income and wealth, richer people live longer, as we know, and this is life expectancy here, and this is income. Now, what is stunning, though, is that if you take the top line like that, you can get from $1,000 per capita about 80% of the welfare of $20,000 per capita. So that's quite interesting. But more interesting is that over time, you will note that for the same $1,000, the amount of life expectancy you're getting is increasing. And that's the result of better policy, vaccination of children, better programs, children's food feed, and so on. Now, if you were to stay with the available technologies in 1950, to get from here to here, you would have needed to reach this level of income, which is basically close to 8,000. And that means that you were able to get an improvement by policy that if you relied only on economic growth, GNP per capita growth, you would have had to reach 8 times. You would have had to multiply the income 8 times in order to get what you get with good policy and good programs. So good policy and good programs, the P in IFPRI, we absolutely need that. And we needed to transform global agriculture, which is very complicated, and which is really completely different in different parts of the world. What do? Here are my 10 points. Take them as 10 commands. Reform policies and markets. We talked about fair trade. Locally, we talked about urban bias. Focus on smallholder farmers. We talked about that. Husband natural resources, yes, we need to understand that agriculture is the major interface between humans and nature. To preserve habitats and biodiversity, we need to keep agricultural land to a minimum. To raise agricultural productivity faster than the drop of the price, and improve nutritional content, enormous health benefits, not just by the rice, actually, but by many other techniques, including by high-quality proteins to give longer, more productive lives to people. Address short-term vulnerabilities of the farmers that come because of the variability from flood and drought. Empower women, and we talked about that, how essential that is right across the board. Reach out to the ultra-poor because they will not be reached by regular programs only. These are these are the IDPs, the internally displaced persons. They are refugees by any definition. Support science. We need more support for science, not just here, but in the developing countries. This is a preschool in Germany preschool in Africa. Preschool in Germany, preschool in Africa. And you know what that means. Luckily, there's a way of dealing with that. That was at the time I had left the bank, but in 2004 we presented a report called Inventing a Better Future about how to support science in developing countries. But last but not least, to translate rhetoric into action. Declarations, plans, targets are not equal to action. Do you know who said that? We have the capacity to eliminate hunger from the face of the earth in our lifetime. We need only the will. 1963, first summit on abolishing hunger. President John F. Kennedy. Zapiro, again, my cartoonist from South Africa, says it all. English to Arabic, Arabic to French, rhetoric to action. We're still missing a translator. And that's true. So that's what we need to do. And can we do it? I think all the parts are essential. They reinforce each other. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. You need to find the key pressure points and apply the pressure to have maximum impact. No policy or program will be sufficient alone. There's no silver bullet. We need a major action on a broad front, and lots of them will have to be brought together. From all of these, from agriculture, environment, social issues, political issues, participation, gender, urbanization, infrastructure, economy, trade, marketing, public-private interface, finance, credit, local, national, regional, international issues, and so much more. You need to bring all that together. It's like a Rubik's Cube. But you know what? It can be mastered and solved. The Rubik's Cube can be solved. So I think we say, yes, like the abolitionists, we have to dare to dream and dare to be bold. The specter of Malthus still haunts us, but we can abolish hunger in our lifetime. And if our group, all of us, I hope, will be the new abolitionists, we as the new abolitionists are confronting enormous opposition, the cynics, the entrenched interest, and the inertia of current injustice, well, my friends, we're going to surprise the world. Thank you.